They told her to step back. They laughed. They pulled out their phones to film what they were sure would be a disaster. A 53-year-old widow, still wearing black, walking toward a horse that had already put 2 experienced riders in the hospital, and then something happened that nobody in that crowd had a word for. Here's what I want you to think about before we go any further. Have you ever watched someone do something that you were absolutely certain would end in failure, and then felt your whole understanding of a person shift in a single moment? Because that's exactly what happened the afternoon Aubry stepped into that pen. No training, no whip, no plan that anyone could see. Just a woman who had already survived something worse than any horse. If that kind of story speaks to you, the kind where people get it wrong about someone, badly wrong, hit that like button right now, subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next, and drop your city in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from. All right, let's go back to Calder County, and let's start at the beginning. Calder County sits in the high desert of eastern Oregon, the kind of place where the wind has an opinion about everything, and the sky is so wide it makes you feel both free and forgotten at the same time. The towns out there are small enough that everybody knows your truck, and old enough that people still remember your grandparents' mistakes. It's beautiful country, unforgiving country, the kind of place that produces people who don't say much because they've learned that words cost something. Aubry Vain had lived there her whole life, 53 years old, with hands that showed it and eyes that had seen more than she ever talked about. She'd grown up on the eastern edge of the county on her family's place, married at 22, raised 2 kids, buried a husband, and kept going. That last part, the keeping going, was the part nobody around Calder County fully understood because they had watched it happen and still couldn't explain how she did it. Her husband, Dex Vain, died 3 years before this story takes place. Heart attack. 57 years old, strong as an oak his whole life, and then gone on a Tuesday morning in February while he was walking from the barn to the house. Aubry found him in the snow. She'd told that story exactly once to her daughter, and never again. After Dex died, the ranch nearly went with him. He'd been the one who managed the business side of things, the accounts, the contracts, the negotiations with the feed suppliers and the auction houses. Aubry had always handled the animals and the land itself, which she was better at anyway. But without Dex working the numbers, the whole operation started to bleed money slowly, the way a wounded animal bleeds before it finally lays down. Her son, Griffin, was living in Portland and offered to come back. She told him no. Her daughter, Luma, who was closer, lived in Bend, came out every other weekend and watched her mother with a quiet kind of worry that Aubry recognized and gently refused. She wasn't being stubborn, she was being honest. She didn't want to be managed. She wanted to figure out what she still was without Dex standing beside her. That process took about 2 years, and it wasn't pretty. There were months when she barely left the property. There were nights when the silence in that house was something close to physical. She lost weight she hadn't meant to lose. She made decisions about the herd that were practical but heartbreaking. She sold 20 head of cattle that Dex had specifically chosen and bred because she simply could not afford to winter them. She did it without flinching, at least not where anyone could see. By the 3rd year, she had stabilized things. Not comfortable, stable. There was a difference. Stable meant she could pay what she owed and still have enough left over to keep the lights on and the equipment running. It meant she'd learned the parts of the business that Dex had handled and learned them well enough to get through, even if she hated every minute of sitting at a desk with a spreadsheet instead of being outside with the horses, because horses were Aubry's thing. Had been since she was 4 years old, and her grandfather put her up on a broad, gentle mare named something she could no longer remember, and she felt the animal breathe beneath her, and understood, in the way children understand things before language gets in the way, that this was where she belonged. Over the decades, she'd worked with hundreds of horses, quarter horses, paints, the occasional thoroughbred that someone had bought for more money than sense and then needed help with. She'd never trained professionally. That wasn't how she thought of it. She just had a way, Dex used to joke that she spoke horse better than English, and she'd never bothered to disagree. So when the Oleander Ranch, about 12 miles north of her property, put word out in the spring of that third year that they were at a loss with a stallion and were looking for someone who might be willing to consult, Aubry heard about it through Pemberton Gale, who ran the feed store in town and knew everything that happened in Calder County before it actually happened. "You hear about the Oleander horse?" he asked her one morning when she came in for a supply order. "I heard something," she said. "They've had 2 trainers on him. One quit, one got hurt. Horse won't be touched. Beautiful animal, apparently, but mean as a winter storm and twice as cold." Aubry paid for her order and drove home, and didn't think about it again for 3 days. On the 4th day, she called the Oleander Ranch and spoke to the owner, a man named Tuck Sorrells, who sounded relieved and skeptical in equal measure. "I appreciate the call," Tuck said carefully. "But I have to be honest with you, Aubry. This isn't a gentle animal." "I know," she said. "When can I come out?" She drove out to the Oleander Ranch on a Thursday morning in late April, when the high desert was doing that thing it does in spring, where everything smells like rain that happened somewhere else. The land out toward Oleander was flatter than her own property, wider open, the kind of terrain where you could see trouble coming from a long way off, or think you could, which wasn't always the same thing. Tuck Sorrells met her at the gate. He was a big man, somewhere in his mid-60s, with a white mustache and the permanent squint of someone who'd spent 40 years looking into a western sun. He shook her hand with genuine warmth and then walked her toward the main barn without preamble, which she appreciated. "His name's Reckoning," Tuck said, "which I'll admit I thought was a clever name when I bought him 18 months ago, and now I think is the most accurate name I've ever given an animal." "Where'd he come from?" "Nevada. Breeder down in Elko County. Good bloodlines, beautiful conformation. The breeder said he'd had some handling issues, but that a good trainer could bring him through. I should have asked more questions." "What happened with the trainers?" Tuck was quiet for a moment. "First one, fellow named Oswell, who's been working horses in this county for 20 years, said the horse couldn't be read, said he'd try to approach and the animal's body language gave him nothing, no warning, no tells, and then he'd just explode. Oswell said he'd never seen anything like it, and he wasn't too proud to say he was uncomfortable. He walked away after the 3rd session. And the second? Fellow from out of state, came highly recommended, was supposed to be real good with difficult horses. He got into the round pen with Reckoning on the 2nd day, and the horse came at him without any warning at all, knocked him into the fence rail hard, broke 2 ribs and his collarbone. He's recovered, but he told me from his hospital bed that he'd never seen an animal that violent, and that he wasn't coming back under any circumstances. Aubry nodded slowly. "Can I see him before we get to the pen?" Tuck took her around the back of the barn to a large paddock that was separated from the other horses by 2 fences, his own and a buffer zone that Tuck had added after the 2nd trainer got hurt. And there was Reckoning. He was extraordinary. There was no other word for it. 16 hands at least, dark bay with a black mane that moved in the morning wind like something from a painting someone had given up on because they couldn't capture it. His body was all tension and architecture, muscles visible even at rest, chest broad, legs clean and perfectly balanced. He was standing at the far end of the paddock with his head raised, watching them with ears that were neither pinned back in anger nor pricked forward in curiosity. They were still, utterly still. That's what caught Aubry's attention, not the beauty and not the size, the stillness. "He's not afraid of us," she said. "No," Tuck agreed. "And he's not angry right now either." "No. So what is he?" Tuck shook his head. "That's the question, isn't it?" She stood at the fence for a long time without moving. Reckoning watched her. He didn't come closer, didn't retreat, just watched. It was the kind of watching that felt intelligent in a way that made you want to look away first, and she didn't. "How long has he been at the far end like that?" she asked. "Most of the time. He has the whole paddock, but he stays out there, far as he can get from everything." Aubry thought about that. A horse who puts himself as far as possible from everything and then waits, perfectly still, giving you nothing. Not fear, not aggression, just distance and patience. She'd seen that before. Not in a horse. She drove home and spent the next 4 days thinking. She didn't call Tuck. She went about her work, feeding, fencing, the bookkeeping she'd come to grudgingly accept. And she let the image of the horse sit in the back of her mind, the way you let a problem sit when you know rushing it will only make it worse. On the 5th day, she had an answer, or at least the beginning of one. She called Tuck and told him she'd come back on Monday. He said fine, and asked if she needed anything prepared. Round pen, specific equipment. No equipment, she said, and I don't want an audience. There was a pause on the line. I'll do my best, Tuck said, but you should know that word gets around. She knew. Calder County being what it was, word always got around. What she didn't know, couldn't have known, was how many people would show up, because by the time Monday morning came, word hadn't just gotten around. It had gotten amplified. 2 trainers, one of them hospitalized, and now a widow in her 50s was going to try what they couldn't. People found reasons to be at the Oleander Ranch that morning. Ranch hands who were off the clock. Neighbors who claimed they'd just happened to be passing by. Tuck's nephew, Bowen, who drove 40 minutes from the next county because someone had texted him about it. A woman named Florrie, who ran the small diner in town and had never shown any interest in horses in her life, showed up with a thermos of coffee and an expression of genuine anticipation. There were maybe 30 people arranged along the fence by the time Aubry pulled in. She saw them, took in the number, felt something move through her that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite embarrassment. She parked, got out, and walked toward Tuck without acknowledging the crowd. "I'm sorry," Tuck said quietly as she approached. "I tried." "It's all right," she said, and she meant it. She'd spent 3 years learning not to waste energy on things she couldn't change. She heard the murmuring as she walked toward the round pen. She caught words here and there, crazy, and who does she think she is? And once, distinctly, laughter, the particular kind that comes from people who have already decided what the ending is going to be. She didn't stop walking. The round pen at Oleander was good construction, solid pipe rails, about 60 feet in diameter, the footing soft and even. Tuck had done everything right with the facility, even if everything had gone wrong inside it. Reckoning was already in the pen when Aubry arrived at the gate. Someone had moved him in from the paddock earlier that morning, which meant he'd been in the enclosed space for about an hour. She stood at the gate for a full minute before she opened it. Not hesitating, observing. She watched the way the horse moved around the perimeter, not frantic, not frenzied the way a terrified horse moves, bouncing off walls and sweating through its skin. Methodical. He was walking the rail in a steady, deliberate circle, his head at a neutral height, and every few rotations he'd stop and look at the gate. Looking at the gate, not at the people along the fence, at the gate. He wanted out. But he wasn't panicking about it. He was cataloguing his options. Smart, she thought, dangerously smart. She opened the gate, stepped in, and closed it behind her. The crowd sounds changed, the murmuring dropped, and for a moment, just a moment, there was a hush. Then she heard the laughter begin. A couple of voices first, then more, the way laughter spreads when people feel that a social permission has been given. Someone said something she couldn't make out, and the laughter got louder. Reckoning stopped his circuit and looked at her. She stood completely still, her hands loose at her sides, her weight balanced. She was wearing what she always wore, worn jeans, boots that had seen years of hard use, a denim jacket over a plain shirt, no helmet, no protective vest. She'd considered both and decided against them, not out of bravado, but out of a specific theory she was working with. The theory was this: Reckoning's problem wasn't dominance, and it wasn't fear. It was distrust. Specifically, he didn't trust the shapes people made when they came at him. The shapes of control, the equipment, the intent that radiated off trained handlers who'd already decided what the horse needed to do and were communicating that decision with everything in their bodies before they took a step. A horse who trusted nothing about human intention would find the subtlety of body language underneath all that equipment and preparation, and it would read wrong. It would read like a threat being disguised, and an animal smart enough to read that far in would treat disguised threat the same way it treated open threat. What she was going to do was nothing. She was going to stand in the pen and be absolutely, genuinely, specifically nothing. Not a trainer, not a threat, not even a person with a goal, just a presence, breathing, existing, asking nothing. She'd done it before. Once, with a traumatized rescue mare who'd been abused badly enough that she'd attack anything that moved toward her with purpose. Aubry had spent 4 sessions just standing in the mare's paddock at a distance, not looking at her, not moving toward her, just being there. The 5th session, the mare had come to her, not all the way, just close enough to sniff the air near Aubry's shoulder. But that was everything. The situation was different here, more dangerous. She knew that. Reckoning was larger, stronger, and unlike the rescue mare, his aggression wasn't rooted in pain. It was rooted in something colder. She kept coming back to that word, cold, the way Tuck had said it. Mean as a winter storm and twice as cold. But Aubry had spent 3 winters alone in a house that felt emptied of everything. And she'd learned something about cold that she hadn't known before. Cold wasn't always anger. Sometimes cold was the thing a creature built around itself when it had been let down so many times that letting anything in felt like the real danger. Reckoning took 2 steps toward her and stopped. His ears came forward. She didn't look at him directly. She tilted her gaze slightly to the left of him, the kind of non-eye contact that horses read as non-confrontational, and she breathed slowly and let her shoulders drop a centimeter lower. Behind her, along the fence, she could hear the crowd. More laughter now. Someone had their phone out. She'd clocked it when she walked in. There was commentary she couldn't fully hear, but could feel the shape of. They were watching a woman stand in a pen doing nothing, and they thought it was either the setup to a tragedy or the most boring thing they'd seen. She let them think that. Reckoning took another step, then 2 more. He was perhaps 20 feet from her now, and she felt his attention like a hand on her back. Specific, pressing, curious in a way that was almost more frightening than aggression because it was so much harder to predict. He snorted once. She didn't move. He came 3 feet closer and stopped again. She could feel the heat of him now, the particular warm animal smell, hay and sweat and something else, something sharp underneath, like ozone before a storm. And then he pinned his ears. The crowd saw it. She felt the silence change texture along the fence, the laughter dropping out, something more alert taking its place. A few people stepped back from the rail involuntarily. Someone said, "Oh," under their breath. Aubry breathed in, breathed out. She lowered her gaze another fraction. She softened her jaw deliberately. A thing she'd learned translated across species, the way a relaxed jaw changed the whole architecture of a face, made it less predator-shaped. Reckoning's ears came up. Not all the way forward, not soft, but up and rotating the way they do when an animal is recalibrating. She stood in that moment and understood something. He'd pinned those ears not to threaten her, but to test her, to see what she'd do. Every human being who'd come into this pen before had done something, flinched, hardened, moved to assert, moved to defend. She'd done none of those things. She'd just gotten quieter. He didn't know what to make of that. Good, she thought. Good. Neither do I most days. That first session lasted 40 minutes. She stood in that pen for 40 minutes, barely moving, while a crowd of 30 people watched, and the April wind moved over the high desert, and Reckoning circled her 3 more times, came close twice more, and eventually, in the last 5 minutes, so quietly that half the people at the fence didn't even register it, put his nose within 6 inches of her right shoulder, and breathed. Then she walked calmly to the gate, let herself out, and left without speaking to anyone except Tuck, to whom she said 2 words. Tomorrow. Same. The crowd dispersed behind her, and she heard the shift. The laughter was gone. In its place was something more complicated. Speculation, reassessment, a few conversations she could tell were arguments about what they'd seen. She got in her truck and drove home. She came back the next morning and the morning after that. By the fourth session, the crowd had thinned but hadn't disappeared. The people who remained were different from the original 30, more serious, more quiet. Florrie from the diner came back. Tuck's nephew Bowen came back. A teenager named Sabelle, who worked part-time at the Oleander Ranch and had been watching horses her whole young life, came back every single day and stood at the rail with a look on her face like she was trying to memorize something for a test. Each session Aubry moved a little more. The first movement she introduced was simply turning in a slow half-circle so that her back was to reckoning, which was a profound statement in horse language. I am not watching you. I am not measuring you. I am simply here. The first time she did it, she felt the whole crowd tighten. She felt Bowen stop breathing about 20 feet behind her. She heard someone say no very quietly. Reckoning didn't charge her. He stood and stared at her back and then made a sound she'd never heard a horse make before. Not quite a snort, not quite a nicker, something in between, something uncertain. She took that as progress. By the sixth session, he was walking alongside her when she moved slowly around the perimeter. Not beside her exactly, more like maintaining a parallel distance of about 8 feet, matching her pace, stopping when she stopped. The people at the fence were now so quiet that she could hear the wind again. It was Tuck who first said quietly to Bowen, and Bowen told Florrie, who told everyone else, she's not training him, she's making friends with him. That word, friends, spread through the small remaining crowd and through the county, and it was both right and not quite right. What Aubry was doing was closer to something she didn't have a word for in English. It was the process of becoming legible to each other. She was learning the particular grammar of this animal, not horse grammar in general, which she knew well, but his grammar, the specific language of this one horse who had been let down, who had built cold around himself, who tested everything with a precision that felt almost scientific, and in return, she was letting him learn her, which was the part that cost her something. Because being learned meant being open, and she hadn't been open to much for 3 years. On the 8th session, a Sunday, 2 weeks in, she brought an apple. This was not a technique, it was just an apple. She held it in her left hand, palm flat, arm at her side, and she walked into the pen and stood as she always stood. Reckoning came to her in 4 minutes. He came directly, not circling, not testing, just walked straight across the pen to where she stood and put his nose against the hand with the apple and lipped it up with a gentleness that was startling from an animal that had put a man in the hospital. And then he stood with his head close to her shoulder, not quite touching but close, and she felt his breath against her neck, warm and slow. She kept her face very still. Inside, something that had been clenched for 3 years released just slightly, like a first thread worked loose from a knot. Sable, the teenager at the rail, started crying. She didn't make any sound. Aubry only found out about it later from Tuck. Just stood at the fence with tears running down her face. Bowen, who was 34 years old and had grown up around livestock and considered himself entirely unsentimental about animals, turned to Florrie and said quietly, "I don't know what I'm watching, but I don't want it to stop." That was the moment the story really began to travel. Not the first session, with the laughter and the phones, not the crowd and the spectacle of a widow going into a pen with a dangerous horse. This moment, Sunday morning, an apple, a horse deciding to trust, this was the story that started going around, passed from one person to the next, with the particular care people take with things that feel fragile and true. And that was when Calder County started to reconsider what they thought they knew about Aubry Vain. It would take the rest of that spring and one more confrontation for the reconsideration to be complete. The reconsideration didn't start with kindness. It started, the way most reconsiderations do, with someone getting it wrong one more time first. His name was Fenley, and he owned the largest cattle operation in the county, which he managed to bring up in nearly every conversation he had. He was 60 years old, physically impressive in the way that certain men are who've spent their lives doing hard physical work, and he had opinions about horses and horse training that were absolute and loudly held. Fenley had not been among the 30 people at that first session. He'd heard about it and dismissed it with the particular ease of someone who's already assigned everything to a category. Widow, making a spectacle of herself. Category confirmed. No further investigation required. But the story of the apple on Sunday had reached him, as stories in Calder County reached everyone eventually, and it had irritated him in a way he couldn't quite explain. He drove out to Oleander on the Thursday of the third week, uninvited, and stood at the fence with his arms crossed and watched. What he saw was Aubry in the pen, with Reckoning walking beside her, matching her pace, 8 feet off her left shoulder, like he was learning the geography of her, and Tuck standing nearby watching with an expression that Fenley recognized as belonging to a man who has been surprised into changing his mind. "She's got him going around in circles," Fenley said to nobody in particular. "That's not training, that's a slow walk." Nobody responded. Bowen was there, and Sable, and a couple of the ranch hands. None of them looked at Fenley. Fenley watched for another 10 minutes and then said louder, "You need a real trainer on this horse. This is taking forever and it's going nowhere." Aubry, inside the pen, gave no indication she'd heard. Reckoning flicked an ear toward the fence. "That horse needs pressure," Fenley continued. "You can't whisper a stallion into behaving. You need to establish who's in charge." Tuck, who had gone past diplomatic to somewhere quieter, said, "She's got more done in 2 weeks than anyone else managed in 18 months. Going for walks isn't getting things done." Aubry finished her circuit of the pen, stopped near the gate, and Reckoning stopped beside her. She put her hand up, flat palm, no pressure, and rested it against his neck. He didn't move. She held it there for 5 seconds, removed it, and then turned and walked to the gate. She came out of the pen and walked toward Tuck, and Fenley was in the space between them, so she had to approach him. He addressed her directly. "How long is this going to take?" She looked at him with the specific, steady look she'd developed over 53 years and 3 years of silence. The look that her daughter Luma once described as the one that makes you feel like she's already seen where this conversation ends. "As long as it takes," she said. "That's not an answer. It's the only honest one I've got." Fenley shifted his weight. "I'm just saying, and I know horses, I've worked horses my whole life. What you're doing in there is going to plateau. You get him taking apples and walking beside you in a controlled environment, and you think that's progress. But the moment you put a saddle on him—" "I know," she said. Fenley stopped. "I know it'll be different," she said. "That's not what this is for." She paused, choosing her words with the care she always chose words. "This is so that when that moment comes, he has a reason to try. Right now, he has no reason to try anything except keep people out. I'm changing that, slowly. And I know it's slow, and I know it looks like nothing from out here." She glanced back at the pen, where Reckoning was standing at the center of the enclosure watching the gate. "But it isn't nothing," she said. She walked past Fenley to where Tuck was standing, and they talked quietly about feeding schedules and the plan for the following week. Fenley stood where she'd left him for a moment, then walked to his truck and drove away. Bowen told the story of that exchange to Florrie. Florrie told everyone who came into the diner. By the weekend, it had become something that the county turned over in its collective hands, examining it from different angles. What they kept coming back to was the word Aubry had used, reason. She'd said the horse needed a reason to try. And people in Calder County, without quite articulating it to themselves, recognized that as a statement about something larger than horses. Because they'd watched Aubry Vain for 3 years since Dex died, and they'd seen a woman who kept going without any visible reason, who showed up every day to a ranch that was bleeding money, who learned things she hated learning, who sold cattle that meant something to her, who sat in a house full of silence and got up the next morning anyway. And they realized, turning this over, that they'd never given her enough credit for that. They'd described it as stubbornness or toughness, or the vague, admiring category of "she's a strong woman," which is what you say about women when you've run out of more specific things to say. But it wasn't stubbornness and it wasn't toughness. It was the thing she'd just articulated about the horse. She'd found a reason to try. She just hadn't told anyone what it was. The fourth week brought rain. The real kind, not the desert mist, but 3 days of genuine Oregon rain that came across the mountains and settled over Calder County like a long exhale. The outdoor round pen was unusable. Tuck had a covered arena on the back of the property, larger, less controlled, and Aubry asked to use it. Tuck hesitated. "It's bigger," he said. "More variables." "I know," she said. "It's time." She didn't explain further, and he'd learned not to ask for further. The morning she moved to the covered arena, the rain was still coming down. Word had gone out, the way it always did in Calder County, and the bleachers along the side of the arena had people in them. More than the fence crowd at the beginning. Word had traveled further. There were people she didn't recognize, from other counties, other towns. Someone had apparently posted something on social media. She didn't use social media and was only dimly aware that this had been happening throughout, that Sable had been posting short videos from the fence that had been getting significant attention from people who'd never heard of Calder County. But she didn't look at the bleachers. She looked at the arena, and she looked at what Tuck's ranch hand, a quiet man named Peter, was leading into the far end of the arena. Not reckoning. A saddle. Peter was carrying a saddle. Not moving toward the horse with it, just bringing it into the space and setting it on the arena rail on the far side, visible, present, something to be accounted for. This was the thing Fenley had predicted would break it, the presence of equipment, the implication of what came next. Reckoning was brought in from the far gate by Peter, who had been helping Aubry manage the transitions for the past week, the only human being besides her that the horse had allowed within 10 feet. Peter released him and walked out, and Aubry walked in. She felt the shift immediately. The arena was different from the round pen in ways that mattered to an animal like Reckoning, bigger, more acoustically complex. The rain sound on the metal roof, creating a low, constant percussion, the smell of 50 years of other horses in the dirt beneath their feet, and the saddle on the rail, which he'd spotted within the first 30 seconds. He circled it twice. Wide, cautious circles, not looking at it directly, but keeping it in his peripheral vision, his body taut in a way she hadn't felt in a week. She stood at the center of the arena and watched him process. The crowd in the bleachers was quiet. The rain was loud. She waited him out. 5 minutes. 10. He came to her once, as had become his habit, touched his nose to her shoulder, pulled away. He circled the saddle again, closer this time. He stopped and stared at it with both ears pinned flat. And then he screamed. It wasn't the right word. Horses don't scream, but it was the closest thing. It was a sound she'd never heard him make, high and raw and enormous in the covered space, and everyone in the bleachers flinched as one. A woman somewhere in the seats made a sound. The horse launched into a full gallop around the perimeter of the arena, and the thunder of his hooves on the packed dirt was a physical thing you could feel in your chest. Aubry stood at the center and did not move. He came around 3 times, 4 times, moving at the kind of speed that made the distance between them feel suddenly, terribly irrelevant. If he decided to run through the center of the arena instead of around it, there would be nothing she could do. She knew this. She was aware of it the way you're aware of weather, as a fact, not a crisis. On the 5th circuit, he slowed. By the 6th, he was at a canter. By the 8th, a trot. He stopped on the far side of the arena, breathing hard, his sides heaving, and looked at her. She walked toward the saddle. Not toward him, toward the saddle on the rail. She reached it and put her hand on it, and stood there, her hand on the leather, looking at him from across the arena. His ears came forward. She lifted the saddle off the rail. It was heavy, a good working saddle, 35 pounds at least, and she held it against her body without moving, just held it. Let him see her holding it. Let it be a thing she was holding, and not a thing being done to him. He took 3 steps toward her. She waited. 6 more steps. He was 20 feet away now, head lowered slightly, ears still forward but soft at the tips. That specific softness that meant, in the grammar she'd been learning, "I'm listening." She lowered the saddle very slowly until it rested on the arena rail beside her. She stepped away from it, 2 steps, and held out her hand, palm up, asking. He came to her hand. Then he moved his nose toward the saddle and smelled it, a long, thorough smell, nostrils working, and he stepped back once and stood. And then she would think about this moment for the rest of her life, and she would never be able to explain it to anyone's complete satisfaction, including her own. He turned and put his flank alongside the saddle, not all the way, just his shoulder, his neck. He was showing her where. She picked up the saddle pad first, always before the saddle, and she laid it on his back. He stood like bedrock. She reached for the saddle. In the bleachers, nobody breathed. She settled it onto his back as gently as she knew how to do anything in her life. She reached under for the cinch with hands that were absolutely steady. She'd made them steady by sheer decision, the way you decide to get up in a February morning and go find your husband in the snow and keep going afterward. She cinched it, one hole, not tight, just present. Reckoning exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that rippled through his whole body. And then he was still. The silence in that covered arena was the complete absence of everything except rain on a metal roof. 30 seconds of it, maybe more. And then Sable, the teenager, started clapping. Alone at first, hesitant, the way you're not sure if it's appropriate to make noise after something that felt sacred. Then Bowen joined her, then Peter, then the woman who'd made a sound when the horse screamed, then all of it at once, a full bleacher of people, applauding in a covered arena in the rain in a county that most people have never heard of, for a 53-year-old widow who had spent 3 years learning what she still was and had found out. Aubry stood with her hand on the neck of a horse that the county had written off, and she let the sound wash over her, and she looked at the far wall of the arena, and her eyes were very bright. She didn't ride him that day. She wasn't going to. The saddle was enough, more than anyone had imagined possible. And she understood that the horse needed time to carry that weight without the additional complexity of a rider, needed to walk around with it and breathe with it and learn that it didn't hurt and wasn't a trap. She led him around the arena for 20 minutes with the saddle on his back, and he moved like a different animal. Not a broken one, never that. She would not have wanted that. She wanted him whole, just directed. There was a difference, and it mattered to her. Over the following 3 weeks, she progressed with the same unhurried deliberateness. Desensitization work, groundwork, long sessions of building vocabulary between herself and an animal who'd decided she was worth the risk. Tuck paid her for her time, which she accepted without false modesty because she needed the money, and she'd earned it. She sat on him for the first time on a Tuesday in late May, just sitting, not asking him to move, not with reins, just her weight on his back and her hands flat on his withers. He walked 3 steps forward on his own, stopped, and waited. "All right," she said quietly. "All right." Word about what she'd accomplished spread wider than Calder County. Someone from a horse magazine called Tuck asking for an interview. Not with Tuck, specifically with the woman who'd done it. Tuck gave them Aubry's number, expecting her to say no. She thought about it for 2 days and then said yes, not because she wanted attention, because something had shifted in the way she thought about being visible, about letting herself be seen. She'd spent 3 years after Dex died shrinking her perimeter, pulling in, tightening down, making herself smaller so that the loss of him would have less surface area to work on. It had been necessary, it had been right for that time. But reckoning, of all things, had taught her something she hadn't expected to learn from a horse. Distance, as a survival strategy, has a ceiling. You can stand at the far end of the paddock for only so long before what you're doing isn't protection anymore. It's just being alone. She'd gone back toward the world, 1 session at a time, and the world, surprisingly, hadn't destroyed her. It had clapped. Luma came out the week after the arena day, and they sat on the porch in the long Oregon evening, and Aubry told her most of it. Not all. Some of it she was still working out the language for. But she told her daughter about the moment Reckoning turned his flank toward the saddle and showed her where. "He chose it," Luma said. "Yeah," Aubry said. "He chose it." They sat quietly. The stars were coming out over the high desert, one at a time, and then all at once. "Dad would have liked him," Luma said. "I know," Aubry said. "I thought about that." She paused. "I thought about that every single day in that pen." Griffin called from Portland that weekend. He'd heard from Luma. He said he was proud of her. She told him not to get sentimental about it, and he laughed, which was the exact sound she'd been hoping for. Fenley, for his part, drove out to Oleander one more time in June. He didn't say much. He stood at the fence and watched Aubry work Reckoning in the round pen, real work now, responsive, a horse and a person in actual conversation. And when it was done, he walked over to Tuck and said, "I was wrong." Tuck said, "I know." "About what she was doing?" "I know, Fenley." A silence. "She's something else." "She really is," Tuck said. 6 months after that first session in the round pen, Aubry Vain was riding Reckoning across the high desert on a morning in October when the world was going gold and rust, and the air had that particular cold, clean smell that arrives in the high country before winter and makes you want to hold still and breathe it as long as you possibly can. She was not thinking about the crowd. She was not thinking about Fenley or the magazine article that had run in September with a photograph someone had taken through the arena fence. Her hand on the horse's neck, both of them still, the bleachers blurred in the background. She was not thinking about the comments section of Sable's videos, which apparently ran to several thousand comments, most of them from people who'd never met her and never would. She was thinking about the way the ground felt through the horse beneath her. The particular rolling certainty of a horse at an easy canter, the cold air on her face, and she was thinking about Dex, but differently than she used to. For a long time after he died, thinking about him had felt like pressing a bruise, something you did involuntarily and regretted. Now it felt more like carrying something, still heavy, but the kind of weight you could work with. She'd figure out more of the words for it eventually. She had time. Tuck had made an arrangement with her, a real one, contracted specific, for her to continue working with horses that came through the Oleander Ranch with handling issues. It wasn't going to make her rich, but combined with what she was managing from her own place, it would make her stable, more than stable, if the year went the way she thought it was going to. She told Luma about the contract on the phone, and Luma had been so relieved that Aubry had to tell her 3 times that she was fine. She was genuinely fine. She didn't need the reassurance. "I know you're fine," Luma said. "That's why I'm crying." Mud Sabel had started coming to her property on weekends, not officially but consistently, showing up to help with feeding and fencing and watching everything Aubry did with her horses with that focused, memorizing attention she'd shown at the fence. Aubry hadn't made it formal. She was thinking about it. The girl had something. More than something. She had the specific quality that couldn't be taught and that made everything else teachable. She was patient in the way that mattered. Not the passive patience of someone with nothing better to do, but the active patience of someone who understood that being in a hurry was just a way of telling the animal that your schedule mattered more than its trust. Aubry had recognized it because she'd had to relearn it herself. On that October morning, she rode Reckoning out past the northern edge of Tuck's property, where the land dropped gently toward a dry creek bed that would run again in spring, and she stopped him there, and they stood together and looked at the country stretching out ahead of them. He was calm under her, steady. The animal who'd put a man in the hospital, who'd been written off, who'd stood at the far end of a paddock and waited with the patience of something that had given up expecting to be understood. He stood in the October morning and moved one ear back toward her, attending. She put her hand on his neck. She thought about what it was, the thing she'd been doing for months, the thing she hadn't had a word for. The process of becoming legible to each other, of being willing, finally, to be read. It wasn't a technique. It wasn't training exactly. It was the decision to stop making yourself smaller and to stay in the room, or the pen, or the arena, or the life, and let whatever was going to happen be something you moved through together. She'd learned it from a horse, which was either the most embarrassing thing she'd ever admit to or the most important. And she'd decided, somewhere along the line, that it was both. The sun moved higher, the gold got brighter. She asked him gently to move, and he did. There's a thing that happens sometimes in small places. A story starts because people expect a disaster, and then the disaster doesn't come, and in its place something happens that nobody had a category for, and the story changes. It becomes about something different than anyone thought it was going to be about. People in Calder County thought they were going to watch a widow make a mistake. What they watched instead was a woman figure out who she was after the worst loss of her life. And what they found was that they'd underestimated her so completely that their underestimation said more about them than it ever said about her. She didn't need them to witness it, but she let them anyway, and I think that was a kind of grace. If this story reached you today, if something in it landed, if Aubry's name is going to stay with you for a while, the way certain people's names do, then you already know what I'm going to say. The thing she found out is something most of us are still working on. How to stay in the room, how to be patient in a way that's active, not passive, how to let yourself be learned, and how to take one more step towards something you're not sure of, even when you can feel 30 people watching and waiting for you to fail. The crowd laughed. Then silence took over, and in that silence, something worth keeping happened. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, stories about people who get underestimated, who show up quietly and change the room, subscribe and stay close. They're coming, and wherever you're watching from tonight, I'm glad you were here for this one.